Welcome, everyone, to the Girlfriend Book Club's monthly discussion. I'm Shelley Emling, the executive editor of the Girlfriend newsletter. I'm also the moderator of the Girlfriend Book Club. Tonight, we'll be discussing our October book club pick, the Briar Club. And once again, the 90,000 members, I can't believe it's 90,000 members of the Girlfriend Book Club have blown me away with their choice of a book. I read this in about 5 days, I guess, and it just blew me away. It was a page turner from the beginning, and I'm so thrilled that tonight we're actually going to be joined by the New York Times bestselling author Kate Quinn, also the author of The Rose Code and a million other books. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. And I do apologize. You're going to see a dog walking past in the background periodically. But I think we're all used to this from Zoom by now. So thank you for having me and letting me come into your living room and talk a little bit about the Briar Club. So thank you for voting for it.
Such a great book. For the handful of people that may not have read it yet and are tuning in, can you just give us a little bit of a summary of what the book is about?
The Briar Club takes place in early 1950s Washington, D.C., and it is all about a certain slightly dilapidated, down at the heels boarding house in Foggy Bottom, which is designated as a boarding house for ladies of good character only. And a very eclectic group of women live under that roof, and they really have nothing in common except an address. Except, finally, when a young widow from Iowa moves into the room at the very top of the house and begins to pull her oddball neighbors together into something a little more friendly than just, the squabbles in the hallway about who gets the bathroom next. And these women start to realize they have more to offer each other than they thought. However, all of these women have secrets. And on Thanksgiving of 1954, at least one of those secrets is going to come around and in a big way and cause trouble.
So I did read today, I didn't realize this until I was reading about you in the book today. Were all the characters, Claire, Grace, Fliss, everybody, were they all based on real women or not all based on real women?
Not every single one, but almost all the experiences of the women in Briarwood House have their basis in some real facet of life in the 50s, whether that facet is the early development of the human trials of the birth control pill, which is coming around ironically in the baby boom era, whether it is organized crime in Washington, D.C., whether it is, like the real life riot that happened at a mixed club in Maryland where a riot kicks off because a club dared to open its doors and allow Black and white women to dance and socialize together. Whether it was, art theft and destruction in World War II, the Korean War, all of these were facets of the 50s, which I wanted to weave in an organic way by making them part of the lives and pasts of the various women who lived at Briarwood House. Because really the 50s is what I found a fascinating time. We tend to have this idea that the 50s is this very placid decade. No. It's either idyllic or it's repressive, depending on who you talk to.
Beaver or something.
But it's very uneventful, and it's just the boring decade that happens in between, the World War II racked 40s and then the civil rights racked 60s. But there is a lot going on under the surface in the 1950s, and that was really what I wanted to plumb into in the Briar Club, which I did as a way of weaving all of that stuff in the backgrounds and in the pasts and in the various wounds of the women who live in this one house.
So what gave you what prompted you to write this book in the first place?
I like to think of it as being my post-pandemic book. Most of the writers I know have a pandemic book, and I have one myself. It was my previous book, The Diamond Eye. And that's the book in which we poured all of our various, dark and complicated feelings about what it felt like to be stuck at home and isolated and lonely and, during this lockdown period and the pandemic. But I think of this book as my post-pandemic book because it really did come out of my own need for friendship and community and how much I was missing all the people in my life who I had not been able to gather around a dinner table, for, what felt like eons. And I was thinking about the idea of a book where, it is about community. It's about women lifting each other up, and it's about food, and it's about, wine and secrets and all the things that happen when you push these things together, and the things that will come out at a really good dinner party. And so I thought about this book as sort of like, this book came out of, the words are Grace's in the book, but they're also mine. You sort of the desperate need to not only to connect, but to feed and fix the people around us. And so I put all of that into a book, and then and a lot of other things went into it as well. But that was really what the impetus was.
But I mean, there's so much history in this book that you must have done. You said you wrote it since the pandemic. I mean, it must have taken you forever to research this book. I'm just curious as to like, how did you research it? I mean, what was your writing process like?
There was a lot of research for this book because, so many different strands of history from the 1950s to go into it. But I had a lot of really great books, and that, did help me dive deep into that. I relied heavily on newspapers.com, which is wonderful because it gives you the ability to search our own newspapers and headlines for what are the things that are happening around the country just in the ordinary news. And, like that was where I found out, that this one particular club called the Chicklands Club had a race riot in the early 50s. And I had never known about it, but it was a perfect example of a real concrete local event that I could use to dramatize some of the real feelings in the 1950s about race, about racial tensions, and about, the fact that Washington, D.C. was not this glossy, sophisticated capital back then. Right. It was very much a sleepy southern small city where, segregation was still king. And so there was all kinds of research that went through it. I really recommend anybody who wants to do a deep dive themselves into the 50s. That's really fascinating reading. David Halberstam's book, just called The 50s. It really dives into everything from pop culture to politics. And it dives certainly into McCarthyism, which was one of the things I realized would be the atmosphere that would give this book, which is about community and food and family and friends. But it has to have a dark side, of course, because otherwise you can't just write a book where people all come around a table and they have a good time. There has to be a dark side. And that was where I really started thinking about and learning about McCarthyism, the paranoia of that time when, really there was this hugely un-American movement going on about very unconstitutional, about how people could be interrogated and arrested and persecuted for their political beliefs. And that really gave the whole time, especially with the fact that this happened during the Cold War, where there was this paranoia about how the atom bomb was changing daily life and politics, how everybody thought, there's a good chance we may go up in a mushroom cloud any day now, who knows, and how, the USSR is just lurking over the horizon, the evil communists, the evil Russians, and they're the big bad that's right off the screen. And all of that sort of came together. There was a lot of great research on it. But again, as I said, David Halberstam's book, nonfiction book, The 50s, is a really great start for anybody who wants to just know more about this very fascinating decade. I read most of it, to be honest, when I was called in for jury duty in the middle of my research. I just took that thick book and a highlighter and a notepad, and I read my way through, 2 days of jury duty. And I will say, jury duty passed a lot faster than it normally did. I'm glad I wasn't called away from it for a trial.
Well, someone in the book club, when I asked what the members wanted me to ask you, somebody asked if you had ever seen the movie Good Night and Good Luck from 2005.
Yes. Because it is wonderful.
A film about the McCarthy era and about Edward R. Murrow. And they just wondered if you had watched that before you wrote the book or during the book or
there were a number of movies and that contributed to this particular book, but Good Night and Good Luck was definitely one of them. It's really great, and it does such a good job of showing how there were these McCarthy was so powerful, and yet there were these principled people like Edward R. Murrow who regarded it as their duty, to take a hatchet to him whenever they could, and on live news if possible, and they did so, and they were really the ones that helped bring about his fall. And my husband and I watched that, I think a couple of years before I actually came up with the idea of this book, but we watched it, and it was around that time that my husband came up with the idea of a cocktail called the Good Night and Good Luck, which he mixed with some random ingredients in our fridge. And we decided, well, we'll call it that after Edward R. Murrow, toast to him. And I decided when I started to write the book, it's like, well, the cocktail's got to go in. And then that gave me the idea of, in part of the recipes, which my husband, who is a very good cook, pioneered and invented almost all of them.
Well, I was going to ask you that. That was one of my questions because I've seen you ask that before. Did your husband play a role in the creation of the book? And I know he's a cook, a chef. So did he come up with all those recipes or no?
Almost all. There were a couple of recipes that I got from a Ukrainian food blogger because specifically those had to come from a different
Right.
background and, a culture that he was very unfamiliar with. So I wanted to, have something as close to authentic as I could there. But pretty much everything else he came up with. It was, he's a great cook. It's how he relaxes at the end of his day. He's a sailor in the U.S. Navy. So he helped in a number of ways in this book, not only in the creation of the recipes, and all of them have been field tested at home, Casa Quinn, and I can assure you that they are delicious. But also his background in college, one of the things he studied in international relations was the whole World War II and post World War II Soviet bloc and its politics with interacting with Europe and America, and so I'm trying to say this in case there's people who haven't read the ending and that I don't want to ruin the big twist. He let me know the big twist in the book that ends up being the key to one of the characters' backgrounds. And once you read the author note, you'll know exactly which twist that is.
So do you have a favorite recipe from this entire book?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm very fond of the Good Night and Good Luck. It's a very nice treat for a cocktail if you ever feel like celebrating.
What about the cake, the 8-layer cake?
That was the one from the Ukrainian blogger, and it is delicious, but that is a little bit labor intensive.
That sounded labor intensive. So I always ask authors, was there a scene or a character or a chapter that was really particularly more challenging to write than the others? Was there something that was a little bit harder to write about than everything else?
Oh goodness, that's a fun one. I think it was in excuse me. I think it may have been, I have this trouble any book when I have a character who's a mom and has kids, because I do not have any kids. And so therefore, whenever I write children in books, I end up like grilling all of my mom friends to ask, to make sure that I'm, appropriately depicting childhood. And so, I'm asking things like, okay, the heroine, she's got a character a kid who's like 2. I mean, they're walking by then, right? They're talking, like, are they smoking yet? Are they driving an egg behind them? What are they doing? I never have any idea. So my friends, fortunately, always fill me in there. But also for that particular book, part of this book, Fliss, who is the character of the mom in question, she's very much a single mother because her husband is a doctor who is swept up in the so-called doctor draft and sent to Korea. She hasn't seen him in literally a couple of years. Right. And it is very hard. And that part I could do because, I am a military spouse. I know what it's like to be separated for these long deployments. So that is a little more familiar to me. Yeah. But she's also suffering a bit from some postpartum and a lot of mom guilt. And I can research that, but I also wanted to make sure that I depicted that well, because, and that I asked my friends about it and that it rang true to them, the ones who were moms, because I see a lot of it. And it's a huge national conversation right now, is this constant pressure on moms, especially, to be perfect. Like this whole idea that if you aren't performing motherhood, and I say performing because there's now, like, social media has this performative aspect to it, and the idea that everybody could be seeing you or watching you through their phones or on their phone cameras at all times. If you aren't performing motherhood at like a 12 out of 10 at all times, no breaks for you, then you are a failure. And I see the pressure of that on so many women, but it's not something I felt myself. So I wanted to make sure that, that was something that I got right. And I was very relieved when my mom friends who were beta readers for me said, no, that rings really true. I'm glad you put that in. So I was like, yes, thank you.
No, I think you had a conversation with the mother, with somebody, I can't remember which character it was, but where they asked her, would you give your life for your child? And she said, yes, I would, without hesitation. And it was like, even though she thought she was a bad mother, she answered that question really quickly. And I thought that does ring true. That was really truthful.
Yeah, so that's how she feels. And yet she still feels like she's a bad mother, like she's failing, because, she isn't automatically filled with happy, joy feelings all the time, because she's overwhelmed and her kid is in the middle of the terrible twos. And it's really hard.
So I was watching some interviews with you today, as I told you earlier, and I know that you are called the queen of historical fiction now, which is quite a great title for you.
That originally came from Fiona Davis, who is,
Oh,
an absolute queen herself in
she's
historical
been
fiction.
on with us a couple times now. Yeah, she's
And I
great.
feel like I owe her a muffin basket every time I hear that lovely cover quote that she gave me, because it certainly did seem to stick. And I always just kind of want to say, Fiona, thank you so much. You're lovely.
Well, I heard that your mother was a librarian. So I just wondered how much your mother has like impacted your career and your life being a librarian.
Oh, hugely. I mean, she is not only a librarian, but an enormous reader. And I'm very lucky that she's got such a good eye for story and pacing and character that she's still to this day and always has been my very first reader for anything that I write. She's
Wow.
always the first. And, people who always say things like, oh, well, give it to your mom if you want like uncritical praise. Not my mom. And I say that in a good way. Like she will absolutely tell me like, okay, I'm liking this, but the pace is really flagging here. You got to pick it up. Where it's like,
Right.
this character is not ringing true to me. Let's talk it over and make her, work a little better.
Yeah.
But she's still such a great beta reader and critique partner for me, and always will be, I think. And the other way, I think, just from the beginning, before I even knew how to read, she taught me to love story. And, I absolutely, agree that, the old saying that children are made, readers on the laps of their parents, because
Right.
she and my dad also, to a huge degree, they read aloud to me. And before I knew how to read, and I did not learn to read especially early. I wasn't one of those prodigies who was reading at 2 years old.
Right.
But I think they gave me something better, because if you're teaching a 2-year-old to read, well, why should they read? I mean, like, what's their motivation to read,
Right.
unless you've taught them to love story, that there are stories out there that you can read and that will entertain you. My parents taught me very early that stories were amazing. They got me hooked on story. And then by the time I learned to read, and I'm like, oh, I can provide this drug to myself, then I was like, okay, I'm all in. This is great. So they made readers out of me, and my mom especially, just by always having books around, and constantly being someone who talks about books and is reading herself, and bringing me around libraries. So I was around a library, at a very young age, always in and out of them. So libraries were about my playground. So I owe all of that to her, and I count myself very, very lucky.
Well, shout out to all the librarians out there and the
Oh yeah.
libraries. We love them. So how long did it take you to write this book? And what's your writing process like during the day?
Well, I actually am not entirely sure how long it took me to write this book, because I was about 40,000 words into it, or maybe, since it's divided up into viewpoints, and this one has like 8, 9 viewpoints, maybe.
Yeah.
I was only about 3. I had just completed the third one. And I then at that point ended up signing a contract for a different book. And that book was The Phoenix Crown, which I co-authored with my lovely friend and co-author, Janie Chang. And to our great surprise, I mean, we thought that she was going to finish her current book, and then I was going to finish the Briar Club, and then we would write The Phoenix Crown together. The Phoenix Crown being about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. But our publisher wanted it much sooner than that. In fact, they wanted that one to come out before the Briar Club. So I ended up literally I was, 40,000 words into the Briar Club, and then I put the whole thing aside for about 10 months. And then I blasted through the writing of my half of The Phoenix Crown with Janie. And then as soon as that was done and turned in, I just went right back to the Briar Club and cranked right into it again, which it's interesting. It's not a way I have ever worked before. I was not anticipating it, but 1950s McCarthyism is a very different setting from 1906 San Francisco earthquake during the Gilded Age. So at least the two were very, very different. So I can't honestly remember, at this point, how long it would have taken for me to write the whole thing, because it was split in the middle by having to produce, my 50,000 words of a completely different book. But the book itself, in terms of the writing of it, any book that I write, I go through a certain number of months of just research, and that's just where I'm reading everything. I'm doing a lot of outlining. I'm trying to get to know the characters and try to figure out who they are, what do they want, what are their wounds, what are the things that hurt them, what are the things that they, are dreaming about. I try to figure all of that out first, and that's a fun process. It's a lot of reading, a lot of fun research, and a lot of outlining, which I quite enjoy. And then, as soon as I figure I have enough of a handle on that to begin, I start drafting, and then I'll, draft my way through as fast as I can. Generally speaking, for my books, just for the fastest book I ever wrote was The Diamond Die, which I drafted in 3.5 months flat. And that is unusual for me because that was my pandemic book. And I honestly do think that my muse took one look at the world going on outside and just said, I want something more relaxing than this. How about the World War II Russian front? That sounds very relaxing. Sounds great. And she went into that, her admittedly horrendous time period and just disappeared and stayed there. And I think that's why that book drafted so fast. On contrast, The Rose Code probably took the longest. It took about 13 months for that to draft because that was a bigger book even than the Briar Club. And that had so many different, very technical, historical threads that it really needed a lot of fact checking in a way that none of the other ones did. So usually between, 3 months and 13 is somewhere.
That doesn't sound like a lot of time to me, but okay, you're a fast writer. That's all
like a 9-month process, probably, in the usual run of things. I think it was about that for the Briar Club. And then after that, I go on any number of rounds of edits. My mom reads it, my husband reads it, my critique partners read it, my editor reads it, my copy editor reads it, and the formatters read it. And then at each stage of those, I do another round of edits. So there's a lot of polishing.
Yeah. So I just I asked the members of the book club what they wanted me to ask you. And so one of them said, you've written countless books, which book has been your favorite to write so far and why?
I don't really have a favorite book to write. Some of them are easier than others, for sure. Like as I said, The Diamond Die just happened very fast. I think just because of the situation we found ourselves in. Some books have been, quite difficult and nearly felt like they nearly killed me. The Rose Code was one of those, just because of the sheer mass of research that had to be done. But I wouldn't say I have a favorite, more like I have a least favorite. And the least favorite is always whichever book I am currently in the throes of editing, which I always hit a point when I hate it with the fire of 1,000 suns. I want to throw it on the fire and never speak of it again. And the only thing that cures that is being away from it once it, gets out of my hands to the publisher, and then it'll finally come back to me months later. And I'm finally looking through it thinking, all right, maybe this isn't actually the worst thing in the history of the printed word. It's not that bad, maybe. And then, I learned to love it again. So by the time it hits shelves, it has become, just another one of my children who I love deeply.
Yeah. So many people wanted to know, and I did as well. How did you get the idea to make the house like a character in this book, in Briar Club?
Well, it was a relatively late addition to the process in the editing rounds. Originally, those interstitial bits between which follow the Thanksgiving where there's a corpse on the floor in 1954, and then it keeps jumping back to the time that inches progressively closer to Thanksgiving 1954. Originally, those interstitial chapters were written from the point of view of the detective, but I left him just the detective. He didn't even really have a name. And I realized that I was not terribly interested in the idea of who the detective was.
Right.
And I was not interested in having to look up what the procedural process for, all that procedural stuff around a crime would actually be, because there's a lot to get wrong there. And I just realized, I wonder who else could tell that part, because it can't be any of the women, because I need to keep a certain number of secrets from the reader at that point, and they can't know, for one thing, which of the women in that house, if any of them is the corpse on the floor, and which one of them, if any of them, is the person who committed the murder.
Right.
So in order to be able to keep that information separate, like who else could it be? And at some point, I can't remember if I was talking with my mom or whether I was talking with one of my crit partners, the idea of like, well, what if I do something a little bit artsy, with the idea of like, if these walls could talk.
Yeah.
And, I started playing with that idea, and the more I played with it, the more I liked it. So it just kind of happened in one of the very last rounds of editing, and I'm actually really glad that it worked out.
Yeah, it was fantastic, actually. So everybody wants to know, will there be a sequel to this book?
Never say never, but I haven't really, crafted it with the idea of there being a sequel. Mostly, mostly the storylines are tied up the way I like them, but who knows? I mean, I never rule anything out.
So we only have about 5 more minutes, so I want to go quickly here. I think the first book you wrote, was it Mistress of Rome in 2010? Is that right or no?
Yeah, that's correct. That's my
That's
very first book.
Okay. So I just wondered, like, if you can tell us a bit about your background. I mean, is it still, um, was it hard to get that first book published? Did you get a lot of rejection letters, or was it easy, and has it flowed really nicely? I mean, you've written so many books since 2010. I'm curious about like how the road has been for you.
Well, Mistress of Rome was my first published book, but it's not the first book I wrote. I probably have 10 or 11 novels under the bed that will
Wow.
never see the light of day. And that's because I started writing very young. It's like my mom always said, there's that great line about, you have to put in 20,000 hours to get good at something. And I just started my 20,000 hours really young. I mean, I wrote my first book when I was 10. And,
Oh my
it's
gosh.
terrible. It's complete juvenilia. So, no one's ever going to see it. And that's really good. But I never stopped after that. And so all those books were very much worth my time. It was me teaching myself how to do this. And by the time I got to college, it was actually my freshman year of college that I drafted the book that eventually became Mistress of Rome. And by the time I got to college, I was starting to query agents and so forth. And pretty much the way that would work is I would write a book, and then I would go through a literary marketplace and see, make a note of all the agents who were representing historical fiction, and I would query all of them with a very careful query letter, and they would all say no. And then I would say, okay, well, I guess that didn't work, and I'd write another book, and then I would find out who was representing historical fiction if the list had changed, and I'd query another round of agents, and they would all say no. And I pretty much just did this rinse and repeat all through my college years, through 2 degrees when I was at Boston University. And then right after I had graduated, I'm doing auditions, I'm doing I'm working at some administrative assistant job to pay bills. That was around the time that I picked up a literary agent who didn't like the book I was querying, but she was nice enough about my style that I said, well, I wonder if you might like to see something else of mine. And I suggested this novel of ancient Rome, which had been sitting under my bed and periodically being edited and tweaked, for the past 7 years or so. And she liked that one enough that she said, okay, this will need a lot of edits, but I think if you can do that, I'd like to represent you. And I said, all right, I will put the work in. And I did. And then, she managed to sell that some months later after all the edits, and sell that some months later. And that became Mistress of Rome. So that's how it started. I mean, like, I've had books that have, that one did well enough that I got another contract, but I had some other books that didn't go so well. And so it hasn't been like this smooth upward trajectory. Right. It's very much a roller coaster, this line of work. And despite that, though, I feel very, very lucky to be able to do what it is that I do, which I think is the best job in the world, because honestly, for a living, because honestly, if I was not traditionally published, I would still be writing books. I would just be, sticking them in drawers when I was done, rather than to my editor.
So everybody wants to know, do you have any favorite authors, or a book that you've really liked this past year, or, can you recommend anything to the rest of us?
Oh, that's good. I just recently read The God of the Wood. That was excellent. Really recommend it. I'm blanking on the author's name right now, which I wish I couldn't. I should have pulled up some names. Every time someone asks me what I've been reading, like, I vapor lock. But I did have read some really good books this year. I'm currently in the middle of Jodi Picoult's By Any Other Name.
That's our December book club pick, and she's joining us in December.
I'm about midway through that. It's got a lot of great stuff to say about, like, women's stories and who gets to tell them, and how hard it can be to tell women's stories, to not see them marginalized. And another of the books I really loved was Dennis Lehane's Small Mercies, which is a book about a mother looking for her missing teenage daughter in the middle of the absolute kettle about to boil over that is 1970s Boston, in the middle of the desegregation crisis. It is just this fabulous story of a tough as nails woman on a quest, and that is in the middle of this absolute stew of racial tension, and he writes it so well, and it's just beautiful.
I haven't read that one. Okay, one final question. Your book, The Briar Club, is so much about female friendship, and the girlfriend is all about female friendship and the importance of friendship, especially as we grow older. So I just always have to ask, what do you like to do for fun when you're not writing with your girlfriends?
Oh, the thing is that I have a very close group of female friends in almost every place that I've lived, and they're almost all writers because this is a very solitary
Yeah,
business that we do, and it can be difficult to sort of live always inside your head because with the voices that are in there because
yeah,
it can be easy to feel lonely or isolated or a little bit out of step with the rest of the world. So
right.
everywhere I've gone, I have tried to see who are the writers in the area. Can we get together? Can we get out of the studio? And we do, and we get together for brunches, and then we all get caught up. And the thing I find really interesting is that when you have a lot of women writers in one room, it doesn't tend to do the thing that so many women's friendships revolve around, where it's around mutual people that or it's around family, or it's your
Mhm.
friends because your kids are in the same school,
Right.
or like some kind of familial link or a per people link. It's like we get together and we talk. First of all, it's like, how's your book doing? How's that character crisis going? Have you
Mhm.
hit the 40,000 word doldrums yet? Are you in copy edits? We all talk about our books, and we talk about this business that is so weird and so zany. It's such a roller coaster. And then, at that point, we talk deadlines and industry trends, and then we'll get into, you know, what do we think the business is doing and what's the gossip? And after that, it's like we might get into pets. Everyone's showing their pet pictures around. And then at the very end, we might get around to, oh, by the way, how's your family doing? How are the kids? And it's like the most backward thing for
Yeah.
so many female friendships, that this shared passion that we have is allowed to be front and center with us, which is great. And I find it,
That's great.
and it's the hilarious thing about having writer friends is that sometimes it is perfectly normal where you'll have a writer friend. You could list all of her books in order and her heroines and their names and like what their wounds are, but
Yeah.
you aren't. But even though you've been friends for 2 or 3 years, you still aren't 100% certain how many children she has. And it's a very unique way to have a female friendship. And I love it. And I have it
That's
with so many
delightful.
wonderful women, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Well, thank you so much, Kate Quinn, for being with us tonight. The book for October is The Briar Club. If you haven't read it, I think most people watching have. Please buy it and recommend it to your friends. Just a reminder to stay on the Girlfriend Book Club page because I'll be posting conversation starters so that you guys can talk about the book amongst yourselves. And a reminder that next month we have Chris Whitaker joining us on November the 12th to talk about his book, All the Colors of the Dark. So thank you so much, Kate. It was so lovely to meet you for the first time. I loved it. And I loved your book, The Briar Club. So have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Kate.
You too. Thank you so much for reading.
Thanks.